Hey everybody, mel0n here. Welcome back to another episode of the mel0n review. Today we're going to be wrapping up part 2 of my review of the Ninjutso Sora V2. Now on the surface, the Sora V2 seems like a fairly normal asymmetrical mouse, but there's actually a lot more that meets the eye here with the Sora V2, and there are quite a few very surprising things about this mouse. Now before we get into part 2 of my review of the Sora V2, I did want to take a moment to say a big thank you to Ninjutso, who was kind of sent out the Sora V2 for review. I greatly appreciate it. As always, with everything you see here on the channel, it will get unbiased reviews of everything I cover here on the channel, regardless of a free or discounted unit. As always, this video will be fully subtitled and timestamps will be available down in the video description. Alright, now with all the housekeeping stuff out of the way, let's talk about how the Sora V2 held up in terms of gameplay performance. Alright, now overall, the Sora V2 actually performed very well in game. It is definitely a mouse that's a little smaller for my hand size because I have 7.5 by 5 inch hands, so I did have to do a bit of a unique grip on the Sora V2 that I don't commonly use for a lot of other mice. So it was a bit of a transition period of me getting used to the weight of the Sora, the shape of the Sora, and of course this new grip style, but once I did get used to it, the mouse actually performed really well. The biggest highlight I think of this mouse is the weight, just because this mouse is so light coming in, at least on my unit with the X-Ray Pad Jade donut skates on it, around the 41 gram range. That weight was just the biggest kind of highlight of this mouse because it really did feel essentially weightless with a lot of my movements, and the mouse performed exceptionally well across the board in all games. Overwatch, Bad Business, Valorant, whatever I played, the mouse felt incredibly consistent. It felt very snappy, just a very agile feeling mouse, if that makes sense, due to how light it is. But overall across the board, it was just a very solid performing mouse. Nothing that really caused any issues over my testing period. It was just a very well performing all-rounded mouse. Now in terms of the shape of the Sora V2, the shape is relatively the same to the original Sora and the Sora 4K. However, there have been some slight alterations to the actual shell shape. So the rear flare-outs of the mouse have been tightened in a little bit, and the rear hump of the mouse has also been tightened in a little bit to make the Sora V2 a little more optimized for claw grips, which is what this mouse is advertised as the best ideal grip style for by Ninjutso, but I'll talk more about that a little later. Now one oddity about the shell of the Sora V2 is that the bottom of the shell is actually quite inwardly tilted, not nearly as aggressive as it was in the Zowie U2, but it is still noticeable. So for people who have claw grips, you may notice there's a bit of that weird feeling where you're trying to anchor your pinky and your ring finger against the side of the mouse because it's tilted inward. You can use grip tape to kind of reduce this feeling, which is something I end up doing, but I'll talk about that a little later. But the inward tilting isn't nearly as aggressive as it is in the Zowie U2, and it didn't have the same problems I had in the Zowie U2 on the Sora V2. But I did want to mention, as it is something you don't really see on a lot of mice with this inward tilted shell. Now when it comes to the grip compatibility for the Sora V2 in the contact areas, as I mentioned before, the Sora V2 is optimized as a claw grip mouse. However, it is on the smaller side compared to a lot of other mice in the market I have tried, and as such the grip compatibility in contact areas is going to be a little different for the Sora V2 as opposed to a lot of the other claw grip optimized mice you see on the market. So for small hands, the Sora V2 is going to be best optimized for palm, claw, and fingertip grips. For medium hands, exactly the same as small hands, but just more of a balanced emphasis across the board, where palm, claw, and fingertip grips are all going to be very viable. Now when it comes to large hands or larger hands, this is where the Sora V2 did get kind of odd because I actually can claw grip the Sora V2 with my 7.5 by 5 inch hands. The mouse is just ever so slightly too small for me to even do like an aggro claw on it like I've done with other smaller mice. So because of that, I actually had to use the Sora V2 as a fingertip mouse. Now traditionally I don't really like doing fingertip grip just because I don't really find it to be very consistent, but because the Sora V2 is so light, it was actually really comfortable for me to fingertip grip. I will say, since the sides of the shell are inwardly tilted as I mentioned before, sometimes this was a bit of an issue because it did make it kind of hard to anchor my fingers at the bottom of the mouse's shell just because it tilts inwards. I did end up installing the X-Ray Pad Gecko Grips 2.0 to kind of help with the gripability, and in combination with using the Delta Hub Carpio 2.0, I was able to very comfortably use the Sora V2 as a fingertip mouse. And despite me not really liking fingertip grip and not really liking fingertip grip mice, the Sora V2 actually performed exceptionally well in that regards. So while this mouse may be claw grippable for some larger hands, maybe more in the medium to large hand size, for my hand size is 7.5 by 5 inch hands, fingertip was the only viable option, but the mouse did perform exceptionally well as a fingertip grip mouse. Now I did want to talk about the contact areas briefly. Now since I wasn't really able to traditionally grip this mouse with my normal grip style, I'm not going to be talking about my hand size contact areas just because it's not really accurate. For like medium to semi-large hands, you'll probably get most of your contact in thenar, hyperthenar. Same for medium hands. For small hands or small to medium hands, it'll probably be a lot more balance between mid-palm, hyperthenar, and thenar, but again, it'll depend on the contact area because the rear of the Sora V2 is that just kind of standard wide thin hump you see on a lot of other mice. So the hump is definitely really well designed for claw grip. It will feel comfortable for smaller hand sizes, but as I mentioned before, for bigger hand sizes like myself, the Sora V2 is going to be a primarily fingertip mouse. All right, now in terms of build quality and QC, one very surprising thing about the Sora V2 is that this is following in the same steps as the Sprime PM1, where this is an entirely polycarbonate mouse. Now, ironically enough, compared to the Sprime PM1 and the Sora V2, they're actually extremely similar, which you'll see more similarities as we go through the rest of this video, but both of those mice do share the exact same material. They're polycarbonate material, and they both share the exact same coating, which is a really great thing to see. Now, on top of that, the Sora V2 does share the Sprime's exceptionally good build quality, so across the board, this mouse is actually very, very solidly built. Again, with the polycarbonate material, it does have a lot of flex to it. It does rely on the surface-to-base contact shell for a lot of its rigidity, but this mouse does actually feel very, very solid. Of course, it's going to have a little more flex to the material than you would see on a standard plastic mouse, but during use, I didn't notice any creaking or flexing or anything that would impact the performance. Of course, you have to really push into it to feel the flex of the material, but just like we saw with the Sprime PM1 with the same polycarbonate material, the Sora V2 does feel exceptionally good here. QC is also pretty much flawless, so keep in mind though, my unit did come directly from Ninjutso, but the QC on my unit has been very solid, and I haven't heard of any QC issues across the board with anyone else who got Sora units as well. So across the board, it is just a very, very well built and a very well QC'd mouse. Now, some of you may have caught that I said something a little odd here, where I said the Sora V2 is coming in at 41 grams. Now, if you look on the advertisements for the Sora V2, Ninjutso is saying that this mouse is actually weighing in at 39 grams, which is technically correct. However, Ninjutso is advertising the mouse as weighing 39 grams without any skates installed on the mouse, which is how it comes out of the box. So while the mouse itself does actually weigh 39 grams, it's not accounting for the extra weight of skates. So in my situation, I was able to bring my mouse more around to the 40.5 to 41 gram range. So just keep in mind, while they are advertising his mouse as weighing 39 grams, which is technically correct, it's not accounting for the skates on the mouse, which is unfortunate to see. I would much rather see Ninjutso advertise this mouse as being 41, 42 grams and have it come a little lower than that. I just don't really like the way they're advertising the weight of the mouse. But despite that, the 41 gram weight with the stock skates is still completely fine. It is one of the lightest mice I've ever used. And as I mentioned before when I talked about the in-game performance, this mouse feels essentially weightless. Even with a fingertip grip, this mouse feels like nothing. So despite the weight advertisements being not entirely accurate, it is still a very well weighted mouse that does feel very, very solid as well. On that note as well, weight balancing is also perfect on this unit as well, which is really nice to see. Alrighty, now the Sora V2 is using mel0ns as the main click buttons. The implementation actually feels very similar to the main buttons we found in the Sprime PM1, but the ones here on the Sora V2 are ever so slightly heavier in terms of their actuation weight. I'll give you a quick little sound test here. Now, in terms of the click feeling on the Sora V2, there was essentially no pre-travel and a medium amount of post-travel. Of course, when you press it into the shell, there was a little more give at the end of it, but the click does feel consistent across the entire shell button. The clicks do have a really nice rebound to them as well. They're very well stabilized. They just feel very, very snappy and consistent overall, which is great to see. There is a slight bit of play from left to right on the buttons, but you do have to kind of push them out of the way for that to happen. Nothing you'd run into during normal use. So again, the very good anchoring and stabilization really comes into play here as well. Now, the main shell clicks do also have a bit of an indentation in them, like kind of this concave indentation that goes up to about halfway of the actual main click. Now, this really does help guide your fingers into the middle of the clicks and does help them feel very consistent as well. Overall, no problems with implementation. They're just really, really solid. And another really nice thing to see here on the Sora V2 is that the main buttons do share the same coating as the rest of the mouse, which is fantastic to see. So the same really solid coating we saw on the Sprime PM1 is here on the Sora V2, and it does perform very, very well, specifically for the main buttons as well. Overall, the main clicks feel very solid. No issues in terms of implementation. I haven't run into any problems during my testing. Just a really solid click implementation. Alrighty, now when it comes to the side buttons of the Sora V2, and no surprise to pretty much anyone right now, it is using 1 white dot buttons for the side switches. This is what we've seen on pretty much every single mouse in the market here, and it is continuing here on the Sora V2. Now, very similar to the main clicks, the side buttons here are incredibly similar to the side buttons we saw in the Sprime PM1. However, they are just ever so slightly lighter in terms of the actuation. I'll give you a little bit of a sound test here. Now, in terms of the click feeling itself, there is a slight bit of pre-travel and a very, very, very minimal amount of post-travel, almost negligible, I would say. They feel really, really well tensioned. They have a great rebound. They're very well stabilized. Overall, they feel like a very, very solid side button implementation. Again, extremely similar to the Sprime PM1. Now, speaking of that, the side buttons themselves are actually the exact same ones we saw in the Sprime PM1, where they're ever so slightly rounded pill-shaped side buttons. They've just been scaled down to fit the symmetrical shape of the Sora V2. The Sora V2 side buttons also share the same coating as the main main clicks in the rest of the shell, which is fantastic to see. So in combination with their actual physical design and the coating on them, they're very grippy and they're very easy to actuate. They just feel very, very solid overall. Now the side buttons are also very well positioned for claw grips and fingertip grips. They're very easy to actuate. For smaller hands with a palm grip, they may be a little hard to actuate the back button, but the first button is very easy to actuate across the board, which is really nice to see. Overall, the side buttons are incredibly well implemented. Again, very, very similar to the Prime PM1 side buttons, which I also loved. So I'm very happy to see a similar implementation here on the Sora V2. All right, now in terms of the scroll wheel implementation, the scroll wheel will probably look very familiar to you because it is the exact same scroll wheel we saw on the Prime PM1. The only difference is that the rubber texturing on the inside has been changed from a red one to a blue one, but both of them have the same texture. Very easy to actuate, very grippy. Overall, no problems with that. The Sora V2 is using a slightly different encoder. In the Prime PM1, we saw a TTC 12mm encoder, but this one is using a 9mm encoder. It has a bit of a heavier scroll, but it does have less pronounced scroll points, which is a benefit, I guess. I do prefer the feeling of the 12mm encoder on the Prime PM1 over the one here on the Sora V2, but it's a very minimal difference. The one here is still completely usable. It's just a little heavier. Now, the scroll wheel switch is yet another one of those very odd pillar switches that we saw on the Prime PM1, the Death Adder V3, and the Zowie U2. Now, unfortunately, there's no identifying markers on the switch, so I can't tell what it is. I reached out to Ninjutso to see if I can get them to tell me what the switch was, and they just never read my message, unfortunately. So, unfortunately, I can't tell you what the switch is. I will say, though, in terms of how it feels, it pretty much feels one for one with the click on the Death Adder V3, which means it's going to be a little heavier than the one we found on the Prime PM1, but still completely usable. Again, I wish I could tell you guys what the switch was, but there's just no identifying markers on it, unfortunately. But overall, the scroll wheel implementation is still completely fine, just a little heavier in terms of the scrolling and the actual click than we find on the Prime PM1. All right, now in terms of the sensor in the MCU here, unsurprisingly, we have the standard combination we've seen on pretty much every other high-performance mouse on the market right now. Then we have the Pixar 3395 DM T6QU and the Nordic 52840 combo. Again, this is on pretty much every single high-performing mouse in the market right now, so pretty unsurprising to see here on the Sora V2. Now, the 3395 here on the Sora V2 is an uncapped version of the 3395, so the DPI is not locked down to 3200 like we saw on the Vaxi mice or the Zowie U2. You can take full advantage of the 26,000 DPI range on the sensor, which is nice to see. Now, motion sync is also available on the sensor. You can just turn it on and off in the software. Now, this mouse, since it is using the Nordic 52840 and 3395 combo, is capable of 8K polling rate and is advertised as having 8K polling rate, but unfortunately, it is in the same boat as the Prime PM1 right now, where we are stuck waiting for the 8K dongles to release. Both the Sora V2 and the Prime PM1 are manufactured in the same factory, so I'm assuming there is a delay with the dongle implementation for whatever reason. I don't know what's happening. They haven't said anything, and they haven't replied to any of my messages asking them what's going on with it. So it means both these mice, the Sora V2 and the Prime PM1, are capped to 1K polling rate right now, which isn't a deal breaker by any means, but it would have been nice to see the 8K dongle available a little earlier right now, just because we're all kind of stuck waiting for it to come out. But whenever it does finally release, I will make a video talking about the Sora V2 and the Prime PM1 and how the implementation is on both of those mice, so get subscribed so you don't miss that. Now, while we're just talking about the sensor in the MCU and high polling rate, I did also want to mention that the Sora V2 does have two performance modes. So there is a high speed mode and there is a competitive mode. Now, this is the exact same thing that we've seen on the Prime PM1. Again, since these two mice are made in the same factory, that's pretty unsurprising to see, but I'm actually quite happy to see an extra performance mode here on the Sora V2. As I said when I talked about the Prime PM1, it's nice being able to squeeze a little more performance out of your mouse without having to rely on 2 and 4K polling rate, and it's nice to see that here again on the Sora V2. Of course, it does impact the battery performance of the mouse, but we'll talk about that a little later. All right, now one thing I did want to talk about specifically about these stock skates here is that while the Sora does come with a speed and a control set of skates, they are not pre-installed on the mouse out of the box. Commonly, we see the speed sets pre-installed on the mouse like we saw on the Wizawa Cloud. We have an extra set of control skates. Now, I don't necessarily mind that, but I actually like what Ninjutso did here, where it gives the user the choice to put on whatever they like. Now, of course, their reasoning for this was not for user convenience. Their reason for doing this was that the mouse actually weighed 39 grams, which again is a little disingenuous to what the actual weight of the product is. But regardless of their true intentions of it, I actually really do like this. Now, the skates themselves are the exact same skates we saw with the Prime PM1. They're the exact same sizes. They are just dyed PTFE skates. They're still fine. They're not the greatest though. They're just kind of normal. They're just kind of mid skates, I guess you could say. I ended up installing the XtraPad J donut skates as I prefer those a lot more. So while the stock skates are okay, you're obviously going to be better off with aftermarkets. And since the mouse doesn't come with them pre-installed, it's actually very, very easy to install the aftermarket skates. Alrighty, now in terms of the battery, the Sora V2 is using the exact same 250 milliamp hour battery we saw on the Prime PM1. Now the battery life here on the Sora V2 is a little longer than it was on the Prime PM1. It's coming in at 80 hours instead of the Prime PM1 70. Now, of course, with the competitive mode, mode, that's going to knock the battery life down to more around the 75-78 hour range, but that'll vary depending on your use case. Now, honestly, I don't really mind the battery performance. It was completely fine in my opinion. I think I averaged around 75 to 80 hours on my unit. It was completely fine. What I do have a slight problem with, or I may have a problem with in the future, I guess you could say, is the implementation with high polling rate, because again, 4K and 8K polling rate pretty much halves and quarters your battery life respectively. And since this is using a smaller battery, I just don't know how good the battery life is going to be on high polling rate. So I do have some concerns there, but again, we don't know what 8K and 4K polling performance really looks like yet because the dongle isn't out yet. I'll cover that in my roundup of the 8K polling performance implementation on the Ninjutso Sora V2 and the Sprime PM1 whenever the dongles do release at some point in the future. So again, get subscribed so you don't miss that. All right, now I did also want to talk about the charging here on the Sora V2. Now the Sora V2 does use a standard USB-C port. However, just like the Sprime PM1, it is this odd sized port which makes standard USB-C cables not able to make a connection here on the Sora V2, which means I'm in the same incredibly frustrating situation as I was with the Sprime PM1, because just like I said when I reviewed that mouse, the Sprime PM1 was essentially a perfect mouse. It's just marred by this unnecessary custom sized USB-C port, and we have the exact same situation here on the Sora V2 where this mouse is essentially perfect. There really isn't anything wrong with this mouse in my opinion. It just has a completely unnecessary custom sized USB-C port, so you have to use the cable that came with your Sora V2, or I guess the cable with the Sprime PM1 because they're the exact same size, to charge your mouse. I would really like to see Ninjutso and Sprime, of course, fix this on future versions of these mice and make it the full size port, because there is just no reason to have a custom sized USB-C port on a mouse in 2024. It just doesn't make any sense. All right, now one thing I really do have to highlight here on the Sora V2 is the web-based software. Now, again, as I just keep saying with this review, it's again very similar to the Sprime PM1's implementation of their web-based software, but the web-based software here on the Sora V2 is really nice. It does only work on Edge and Chrome currently. I'm not sure if they're going to add more browsers in the future, but regardless, it does work completely fine. The implementation is very solid. The software is very lightweight, very easy to use, no complaints in implementation, and I'm just really liking all these web-based softwares. They just make things super easy, and I'm very happy to see a really solid implementation here on the Sora V2. Alrighty, and lastly, I also wanted to talk about repairability. Now, of course, since this is a new polycarbonate material, I did have some reservations about the repairability of this mouse, but it turns out, just like the Sprime PM1, this is actually a very serviceable mouse. As always, I will have a teardown guide for this mouse coming out in a little bit after this video, so if you want to learn how to take the mouse apart, get subscribed so you don't miss that. Alrighty, well, in conclusion, the Sora V2 is a very solid mouse overall. Considering this mouse only retails for 99 USD, this is probably the best value mouse on the market right now, because I can't think of a single other mouse that is at this price point that delivers this level of performance with this weight, because again, this mouse weighing in only like 41 to 42 grams is insane, and it's such a good performing mouse. I'm really interested to see how this mouse performs with the 8K dongle. Again, similar with this Sprime PM1, that mouse performed exceptionally well, and I really did like that mouse because it is an ergo shape, and I'm just waiting for the 8K dongle to see how it performs on high polling rate. It's the exact same situation here on the Sora V2 where the mouse performs really good. I really like the mouse. I just would love to see how well it performs with the extra polling rate implementation, but we'll have to wait and see. Currently, the Sora V2 is up for pre-order over on Ninjutso's website, so if you'd like to learn more about it and get one for yourself, I will have the product page linked down in the video description. It will be non-affiliate as always. But that pretty much wraps up my review of the Ninjutso Sora V2. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. I greatly appreciate that. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can always become a member here, and that helps fund teardown projects and everything else I'm doing here on the channel. Thank you very much, Ninjutso, for sending over the Sora V2. I greatly appreciate it, and I will catch you guys all in the teardown of the Sora V2 coming out in a couple days. But I'll see you guys then. Peace.